hello everyone, and welcome to this special webinar with the Australian Wildlife Conservancy. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm delighted to say that we've got around 123 people on this call, so we're incredibly grateful to you all for joining us today. I hope I'm a familiar and friendly face for you now. My name is Amy House, and I am Australian Wildlife Conservancy's Chief Development Officer. So it's my job to make sure that this organisation has the financial capacity to do its vital conservation work, and also to make sure that you, as our supporters, you are demonstrated the impact of your investment in the Australian Wildlife Conservancy. Now, I'm coming to you today from Wajak Noongar Budja in Western Australia. We've got the first real breaking rains of the season. So if you hear any beautiful rolling weather behind me, that is why, and it is a delight to be on this country. I acknowledge elders past, present and emerging, and I pay my respects, and I also make my commitment to care for this country. Also joining me and caring for country is the CEO of the AWC, that is Tim Allard. Tim's going to talk to you shortly. And also joining on the call, we've got AWC Board Director, Guy Fergusson, and co-founder of the Australian Women for Conservation Initiative and long-time AWC supporter, Georgie as well. So welcome, Guy and Georgie. And you'll also see Carrie on the call. If you don't know Carrie already, Carrie Alexander is our associate in charge of the Bequests program, or our Gifts in Will program. And that's what brings us here today. So yes, welcome to the webinar. Now, you guys have got your cameras off because there are so many of us on the call. So kick back, relax. If you've got a cup of tea, join in with the cup of tea. And should you wish to participate, please just feel free to pop a chat in the chat function. Carrie and I will field that chat as the webinar progresses. So you do have a chance to participate during the session. But if we don't get to a question, or you think of something but you're not quite ready to share it in this forum, just contact Carrie or I afterwards, and we will be very, very pleased to speak to you about it. So why are we here today? Well, it's a really important inaugural webinar for us to celebrate and acknowledge the Copley Circle. The Copley Circle is a group of leadership donors who have committed to making a gift in will, supporting the legacy of the AWC for future generations. This is a critical part of our forward planning as a non-profit, and the way that we structure our programs into the future really does make a great difference when we can rely on future thinking with our donor supporters as well. So thank you so much for all of you who are part of that Copley Circle, and also thank you for joining if you're considering supporting AWC into the future. We do treat each other like family, and we want to make sure that you are kept in the know and informed about where AWC is going by us, your leadership team. It's a timely opportunity to connect with you because this year marks 10 years since the passing of our founder, Martin Copley. Some of you will have met Martin, and some of you will know of Martin's legacy for wildlife. Martin's vision was to protect and conserve wildlife in a very pragmatic way, starting with a property close to where I am situated right now, here in Perth in WA. And he created a sanctuary for wildlife, which is still flourishing to this very moment. From that legacy, we have expanded our footprint right the way across Australia. We now know that every bit of action we take right now will support Australian wildlife for generations to come. It has never been more critical. So, to take you through a little snapshot of where we are, where we've come from, and where we are going, and how your long-term contribution is helping our long-term vision for conservation, I'm going to pass you over now to Tim Allard. Tim, over to you.
Thank you, Amy. And again, it is just to reflect a little bit that it's 10 years since Martin Copley passed away, and rarely does a day go past when I'm not reminded of the vision and the legacy that Martin left us, and I suppose as much as anything, it's a responsibility I feel to make sure we're carrying on his vision and his legacy into the future. I would argue that the reasons for AWC existing now are probably more important than they were 32 years ago. And I'll touch on a little bit of that in a moment. Hopefully I've met many of you across the years. I've been with AWC now for 13 years. And really, Martin was my introduction to AWC. I had, for those who've heard the story, I'll cut it short, but I come from an engineering, mining and oil and gas background, and I was looking for something different. And one Friday evening, after half a bottle of red wine, I saw an advert in the paper for Australian Wildlife Conservancy. And 3 days later, I was in and met Martin and my predecessor, Atticus, as chief executive. And 3 weeks later, I was in and being interviewed. And at the end of the interview, Martin asked me, and he said, "Well, what's your passion? Is it birds? Is it mammals? Is it reptiles?" I said, "Martin, if it's anything, I like to see a healthy landscape, but really, I want to see a great organisation be sustainable and impactful into the future." And it must have been just a stroke of genius at the time, because Martin offered me the job, and here I am 13 years later. But I thought, just given the context of the call, that I might just take a step back and talk a little bit about where we are as a society, both at a planetary level and we'll drill down into AWC to where we are today. This is not an AWC 101 presentation yet. Many of you will have gone through that, but I really want to start painting a picture of what does the next decade look like. We're thinking about our our strategic plan over the next 10 years, and thinking about what are the issues and the threats and the emerging challenges and opportunities to do things over the next decade. So bear with me. I am going to terribly challenged to share my screen. And I'll just get a thumbs up from Amy that that's come through. Cool. So the World Economic Forum, that many of you would be familiar with, an international forum, came up with this statement last year: over half of the world's GDP is moderately or highly dependent on nature and its services. You can essentially boil that down, and the work's been done to put that in the Australian context, that half of our GDP in Australia is reliant upon nature. And when you really start to dig into that, half of Australia is managed under some form of pastoralism. So that in of itself gives you a sense of how much of our country, how much of the continent of Australia is reliant upon nature. And you start to think about the threats to those things. For those in New South Wales and Queensland will be familiar with the varroa mite challenge with the honeybee population. If we lose the honeybee population, we start to have crop pollination issues. We start to have food security issues. Half of our GDP is reliant upon nature. Again, the World Economic Forum put together this table. So this was generated by 1,500 of global academics, professionals, politicians, business leaders, and so on. And really looking at the global risks. And in the first 2 years, you can see the slide, really just draw your attention to the green ones. On the left-hand side, in the next 2 years, extreme weather and pollution is down at number 10. But if you look out across the next 10 years, what they've categorised as risks, those top 4 are nature-based risks: extreme weather, critical change to Earth systems, biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse, natural resource shortage. So this is the world saying, and the world leadership is saying, we've got a challenge over the next decade. We're saying half of our GDP, half of our lifestyle, half of our quality of life is reliant upon nature. And yet the top 4 risks over the next decade are likely to be nature-related risks. So we need to do something about it. Some of you might know that a few weeks ago I was in London and we held a very successful event at Australia House. And the question that comes up is, why am I in London talking about Australian biodiversity? There's couple of points I wanted to make around it. In a really rough rule of thumb, and don't quiz me on this because it'll fall apart under scrutiny, most of the world's biodiversity is in the southern hemisphere. You think Africa, you think South America, and you think Australia. But most of the money is in the northern hemisphere. So part of my job is how do I find a way to attract that funding down into the southern hemisphere? Beyond that, in an Australian context, and per that slide, 85% of our biodiversity is endemic to Australia. You can't find it anywhere else. If we lose it here, we lose it at a planetary level. Australia as a continent represents 5% of the planet's landmass and anywhere between 7 to 10% of global biodiversity. So in other words, if we screw it up in Australia, we start to have an impact at a global level. This chart comes from the Turn and ANU, Australia's Environment Report 2023. And look, you don't have to look too hard to realise that's not a great indicator of the state of biodiversity in Australia. And if you've been following AWC for a number of years, you'll have seen us put up these graphs year after year after year. Yeah, this is not great. We're living in a country with up to 10% of the global biodiversity, and yet we're seeing this continued decline in our biodiversity. We've got more and more species being added to the list. I think we're now over 2,000 species that are threatened with some level of extinction. More and more species continue to suffer into decline. In the report, the only areas of bright areas, it calls out those areas that are intensively managed or intervention managed is where you're getting a response. In other words, the work of AWC and some other organisations, but the work of AWC where you're making a direct management intervention into conservation is a few areas where you're getting a response in biodiversity. So it brings it to AWC, and hopefully everybody, if you're supporting AWC, you should almost know this by heart, and if you don't, we'll catch up and have a chat about that later. The effective conservation of all Australian wildlife and their habitats. That is our mission, and that's been our mission for essentially 30 years. Every decision I make, everything I think about at AWC is filtered through the lens of the mission. Does it deliver effective conservation for Australian wildlife and their habitats? And the second piece is our vision, a world where Australia's biodiversity is valued and effectively conserved by an engaged community. And it's recognising that we can't do everything ourselves. This is a big job out there. We need to bring the community along with what we do. Partly, we need to educate people about why Australia is so important, as I talked about before, but also to bring more people to AWC. We need more people to fund and support the work of AWC. But fundamentally, we need to recognise as a community, as an Australian society, as a community, as a planetary society and community, the importance of Australia's biodiversity. We're a big country. And just to give you a working example, the Kimberley is 3 times the size of England with 7,500 people in it. And you compare that against the English population of whatever it is, 40 to 50 million in England. So we've got an area that's, Kimberley, 3 times the size of England with 7,500 people. So we've got all this biodiversity. Government don't have the resources to fund all the work that's needed or choose to put that funding elsewhere. And so it requires organisations like AWC and supporters like yourselves to make sure we can intervene and have an impact on what we do. So where have we got to today? We now protect 88% of all bird species, 74% of all mammal species, and 54% of reptiles and frogs. That's pretty good. That's a pretty remarkable achievement. But ultimately, our mission says we need to get that to 100% across all those categories. So it means there's much more work to go. I thought I'd quickly reflect on, this is really a look back where we've been in existence for 32 years. So if we break it really into 2 decades, the first 2 decades of AWC's journey was really growth by acquisition. We went off and bought land. Martin started with Crackamire Wildlife Sanctuary here in Perth, with a few in the southwest. Then we moved to the Kimberley with Mornington, Marion Downs, and so on. Then across to Queensland, and off we went. The last seven to 10 years, our journey of growth has largely been through partnership development. And that's coming back to that point that we can't do all this by ourselves, but it's also underpinned by the brutal reality that the cost of land is going through the roof. We're competing with big interests, big pastoral corporates, big corporations who want to buy land. And so we need to find other ways to secure access to land. And the working example I give everybody is a property in the Gulf country of the Northern Territory called Wollongong Station. It's about 800,000 hectares, and it's the only place you can find this little animal called the Carpentarian rock rat. So a very cute little animal about yay big, can only be found on Wollongong Station. Martin looked at Wollongong back in 2010, 2011, and it was on the market for $21 million. And it sold 18 months ago for $57 million. So there's no way that AWC or any not-for-profit really can raise that type of capital, let alone the $2 million a year to manage the property. So we need to find other ways to go off and deliver our effective conservation work. And you'll have noted over the last 5, 6, 7 years, the partnerships with those big landholding groups and communities, Indigenous First Nations communities, private landholders, pastoralists, government agencies, including the Department of Defence, New South Wales National Parks, and so on. It's who has land where we can go and deliver effective conservation, either in collaboration or value adding to land that they're already otherwise managing. Which really brings us to where we are today. So that's our footprint across Australia. And that's pretty significant. I don't put that up just as a look at us, look at the scale of which we operate. That is important. But what's unique about that, and really thinking about the science position and what the science that underpins AWC, is it gives us an ability to think about biodiversity at a national level, the threats and the impacts, the health of our biodiversity at a national level. Nobody else in Australia can do that. No government agency at a federal level or a state level can do that. That's a remarkable thing. So the next decade, and I'll touch on this again in a moment, the next decade I'll be starting to think about where are the gaps in this map? Where do we need to be from a geographical perspective? Where do we need to be from a future-proofing perspective? We think about climate change. Where can we have impact? Where are there strategic opportunities that are starting to present? So I think when you think about AWC and you think about the scale, it's thinking about not just scale for scale's sake, but it's that ability to have an assessment of national biodiversity health. And this is really important when we start to think about the big issues of Australian biodiversity. If we think about the feral cat, we all know that story. Millions of feral cats all eating 5 native animals every night, devastating our biodiversity. One of the long-term solutions that you might have heard us talk about in the past is gene drive as a solution where you edit the genetic sequence of cats so they only reproduce male offspring. That solution is still a couple of decades away, probably 20 years away. I'll be in my rocking chair by the time we actually deploy that in a real world situation. But there's a lot of detail that's got to be put together around that. We need a national feral cat ecology research project to understand the behaviour and the ecology of feral cats in all of the regions around Australia. Because when you deploy something like gene drive, you need to deploy it in a manner that you can be most effective with it, where it's going to be able to be replicated across populations. So you need to understand the ecology of cats in that scenario. So that national footprint, again, is not just a scale, it delivers us a whole range of opportunities to impact biodiversity at a national level. When we think about a strategic plan, for those who have been involved in strategic plans, one of the fundamental things that you need to understand is what is your value proposition? What sets you apart, makes you unique against every other organisation? Why should you, as supporters and bequesters and potential bequesters, want to support an organisation like AWC? Well, I tell you, it is the scale, the depth, the expertise and the gravitas of our science program. We have something like 31 PhDs at AWC. A third of our team are scientists. This is a remarkable depth of knowledge and expertise that we have. We've got experts in genetics. We've got experts in climate change. We've got experts in various taxa right across from bats through to reptiles, through to mammals, through to avian species. Yeah, we've got some of the world experts working at AWC. So again, if you bring it back to Martin's position, Martin wanted to set up an organisation. It was a business-like operation in the not-for-profit context, using data, evidence, and knowledge to inform your management action. And this morning, we did a conservation strategy review for the New South Wales region. And that's exactly what we're doing. We're looking at our biodiversity scorecards, or our eco-health scorecards, our eco-health reports. What is the science telling us? And how are we using that information to inform our management programs? That is the value proposition of AWC. It is evidence-based conservation management. This is a sneak peek into a image that you're going to see in Wildlife Matters, which will be hitting your desks over the coming weeks. And Amy might hate me for putting this up, but I thought it's just too good an image to share to give you an example of the scale of impact of AWC. I think the actual individual animal count we've translocated at AWC is 7,380. That's a remarkable effort from what Martin started with at 270 hectares at Crackermire on the outskirts of Perth, where we now have a national footprint of translocating animals all over Australia. We've developed species to be source population, animal populations to be source populations. We've built them, translocating them across the country. We're being approached by other organisations to provide animals. We're now working at a meta population level. We're not doing an individual animal from point A to point B. We're working at a meta level. We're looking at the meta population level, the genetics of those species, and managing it at a national level. This is a remarkable effort for an organisation that you support and you're contributing to. This is what's happened over the last 30 years. Imagine what we can achieve over the next 30 years. I'm very conscious that on this call, we've got Guy Fergusson, who's one of the directors of AWC. So the next few slides, I'm going to take you through our strategic plan initiatives. Guy might have a heart attack because it's not yet been approved by the board, but I'm not going to go into fine detail. We don't have the time for it. But this is really a high level look at what are the key themes for our strategic plan. So I talked about, in a strategy, understanding our value proposition. It's that scale and the science-informed program management. In the strategic plan, we essentially hone in on what are our strategic goals or our strategic pillars. And we're landing on 6 goals, 6 strategic goals, and below each of those goals, we have actions that we're going to work on across the next decade. It will be a 10-year strategic plan. And again, I'm giving you all this early information, and all the communications and development team are probably going to hate me for giving you this early information. But we'll launch this later in the year. It'll be a 2025 to 2035 strategic plan, 10 years, because a lot of what you do in conservation takes time to develop. Partnerships take time to develop. Building trust and aligned values with Indigenous communities takes time to develop. Getting a response in biodiversity takes time to develop. So we're setting up a 10-year strategic plan. So strategic goal number 1, underpinned by the very cute and charismatic northern herring-nosed wombat, wildlife conservation. That is the fundamental pillar of AWC strategy and the work that we do. It's our mission, the effective conservation of all Australian wildlife. Below that are 3 actions. 1 is built on threatened species. We will identify threatened species that need our intervention, and we'll go in and deliver an interventionist project and get a measurable response in their viability over time. We will have a focus on general conservation, and we will have a focus on climate change and other emerging threats. Extend our conservation reach. And this is underpinned by one of my happy places in Australia, the Yampie Sound training area. We will have a target of around 5, influencing the effective conservation across 5% of Australia. We work at just under 2% now. We want to reach 5% in a decade's time. That's about 38 million hectares. And that's a big number, but it's largely mapped out. We know where those opportunities are. We know where the need is. We know what we need to go and do. We are nothing without our people. How do we bring people to AWC? New ecologists, new land managers, new fundraisers, new HR people, accountants, deal makers, commercial knowledge. We need to bring AWC people to AWC. So making sure we're attracting, retaining, and developing and inspiring the best team at AWC that we can possibly have. We need to be a sustainable organisation. This is not about doing things from year to year. It's about taking a long-term look ahead. And we do that already through, we have a capital expenditure look ahead, a 5-year CapEx forecast, thinking about the large-scale projects we need to support and invest in. We think about our sustainability fund, and Guy is on the board subcommittee for the sustainability fund, thinking about where we're investing and managing and the sustainability of our cash reserves, thinking about things like our endowment fund and how we make AWC sustainable into the future, but also thinking about maximising the use of solar energy or renewable energies on our sanctuaries, reducing energy usage. These are big cost issues for AWC. How do we make ourselves the most sustainable organisation that we can? Growing support and investment in conservation. We think to support 5% of Australia's landmass will take a revenue of around $100 million. Now, this is not all philanthropic support, of course. Around 60 to 70% of our income at the moment is through philanthropy. We want to grow other areas of our contract. So when we work for the Department of Defence, we're getting paid to do that. When we're working at somewhere like Buller River Station in the Territory, we're getting paid to do that. What are those opportunities that emerge that allow us to grow philanthropy, but also grow these other opportunities that allow us to be reimbursed for our work? And having engaged communities that value Australia's biodiversity. Again, bringing it back to, we need the Australian community to understand, we need that thing to drop, that I can walk out on the street and say to the average person, or ask them, what do you know about Australia's biodiversity? And people will happily talk about the bilby, the numbat, the Gouldian finch. Now, I suppose, if I start to think about in summary, and I've talked to the board a little bit about this and the management team, and probably sick of hearing me say it. If I put myself in the shoes of a homeless charity or a poverty charity, and you're thinking about your organisational strategy, you're there to feed the line or shorten the line. So feed the line means you've got a line of people lining up every night and you're giving them a hot meal and a mattress so they can sleep safely that night. You're not making any difference to the length of that line, but you're feeding the line to make sure they're looked after. Or you can take an organisational approach, which is, we want to shorten the line. We're going to put in place initiatives to actually stop people going onto that poverty line or homeless line. So if I put that into an AWC context, are we there to shorten the line, or sorry, to feed the line, or are we there to shorten the line? And ultimately, I'm telling you, the goal is to be both, and we can do both. We have the skills, the ability, and the resources to do both. We will feed the line, we'll maintain and manage the sanctuaries on the land that we have now to the best of our ability, but we'll also be looking to introduce mechanisms and programs that stops things going into decline. It's not good enough just to protect what we've got. We have to stop other things sinking onto the threatened species list. And really the last thing I wanted to talk about was, what do I want AWC to be over the next 10 years? Well, I want us to be the best possible conservation organisation we can be. I want us to be the organisation that every other organisation aspires to be like. I want this to be, AWC to be the organisation that governments want to partner with. They want to reach out to us and get our input, our partnership, and our support on their work. I want us to be the organisation that current staff and future staff aspire to work at and develop a career in doing conservation programs through their journey in life. I want us to be the most impactful conservation out there. I want us to deliver the most conservation we can do over the next 10 years with the resources that we can get. So that's really, as much as anything, the sum up of what I think AWC's journey is about over the next 10 years, and why this call about your role in having AWC be a sustainable organisation, having an organisation with longevity and an organisation with impact. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tim. And I might just get you to take your screen share down. Thank you very much. Thanks, Tim. And I hope that those on the call also value that sneak peek into the way AWC is shaping up its 10-year horizon. It is a milestone for AWC, but of course our work will continue long into the future beyond that. But it is very, very important we set ourselves some clear and tangible goals over the coming decade. Now, it's safe to say that as Tim alluded to, the financial pressure that such an incredibly important body of work puts on an organisation, it is real, and it is important that we are acutely aware of the resourcing it will take us to care for some 5% of Australia's landmass and really focus in on 100% of those threatened species. So how are we going to do that? Well, I'm happy to talk to anybody at any time about our strategy towards growing support and investment in conservation. But I will just headline by saying that we do not rely on government funding. That is a cornerstone of AWC's model. We were set up in philanthropy, grounded in philanthropy. And coming back to Martin Copley and his vision for AWC, it wasn't just the pragmatic, and it wasn't just the model itself. Martin left a legacy when he arranged his estate. He set up the Martin Copley Will Trust, and that has created a through flow of funding post his lifetime that has enabled us to think about our forward planning. And so as we start thinking about our 10-year goals, we know we need to forward plan. And when you're running a program that is largely centered in philanthropy, that can be tricky. So we've started thinking more long-term. One of the initiatives that I'm very pleased to pick up on from what Tim said is the Australian Wildlife Endowment Fund. I'll come back to that a little bit later on, but I think it's important to reflect that gifts in will and major gifts can be directed into an endowment fund so that AWC can hold that capital and invest that capital over time. We don't touch that capital. It is there in perpetuity because we know our conservation work will be needed in perpetuity. But what we can do is draw down from the fund annually, from the interest earned, I should say, from that fund, and apply that into our operations so that we can take action with it immediately. So that is something that I'm very happy and keen to talk to you about, should you have an interest in the endowment. And all gifts in wills are a really important part of our forward planning. So we do work with our confirmed bequesters in terms of quantifying where appropriate and where comfortable with the donors, and that just enables us to think about, okay, well, what are our 5-year and 10-year priorities and how do you feel about them? And we can go on a shared journey together towards planning for those things. One of the great attributes of a gift in will that resonates with me is that many of us just simply don't have the capacity to leave the sort of gift during our lifetime that we would like to. We don't necessarily have that capacity. And that's where a gift in will can take our capacity to a whole other level and also enable some of the more significant projects to be undertaken. So a couple of really important attributes in terms of the bequest programme. So to talk a little bit more detail about, well, what is a gift in will? Why would we be trusted as an organisation with a legacy gift? And what does that look like when you are a loving family with children that you are going to also be providing for now and into the future? I'm going to turn over now to Guy and Georgie, if I may, and just ask you to tell us in your own words about your experience, what's brought you to have this conversation with us today. So over to you, Guy and Georgie.
You, Amy. Well, Guy and I, we've been with AWC now for 13 years.
15.
15.
Yeah.
And it all sort of came about because Guy and I were fortunate enough to grow up in the country. Guy grew up on a beef and sheep farm outside a little town called Dunedoo. And I grew up in just outside of Cootamundra. So we grew up in the bush, and, you know, from an early age, we, you know, sort of had an awareness of nature and the ecosystems, but we also lived through, you know, the mice plague, floods, bushfires, and, you know, we saw the impact it could have. So this is where, you know, our passion sort of began. And then...
Yeah, it was really, I started at Grant Samuel, which is a boutique investment bank across Australia and New Zealand back in 2009. It was really a chance-free connection that originally introduced us to AWC. I was walking through our lobby of Governor Macquarie Tower in the CBD here, you know, high-end, you know, suits and corporate attire, and walking through the lobby was this guy who looked like he'd come straight out of the bush in his khaki and his crazy hair, none other than Atticus Fleming, who Tim touched on, yeah, his predecessor and founding CEO of AWC. I, you know, as Georgie mentioned, grew up in central west New South Wales, not far away from where Atticus grew up. We were great family friends, so it was a nice reconnection. And I said, dude, what are you doing here? He said, what are you doing here? I said, I work here. He said, so do I. Grant Samuel provided and still does the Sydney offices for AWC. And so I just inquired, and he explained his role at AWC, the mission, and so it piqued our interest. And we'd already been loosely aware of AWC because Grant Samuel were long-term supporters, but our founder at Grant Samuel, Ross Grant, and his wife Jo were very long-term supporters. He was on the board from 2005 through till 2019, I think. Georgie and I were both quite close to Ross and Jo, and they'd been at us for years and said, you've just got to get to Sanctuary. And so we went to Mornington. I mean, hopefully most of you have had a chance to be to Sanctuary. If not, get there. You know, we were hooked. You know, it was, you know, an amazing experience, but also an emotional experience. I think this is a photo from a few years ago, looking a bit younger. But yeah, as Ross and Jo had said, it's a bucket list experience. It certainly was, and we were hooked. Yeah, and so we've been deeply passionate about AWC ever since their work. We're committed to supporting the mission, both in our official roles, but also sort of personally and financially. And we want to do that now and beyond our time. And so when we were rewriting our wills a couple of years back, it prompted us to think about including AWC. I'd had some insight to the power of the bequest programs from my board role. And this got us thinking, you know, what's important to us in the future, our legacy, and how best to spend some of the fruits of our life's work. And the more we contemplated including a bequest to AWC in our will, the more excited and convinced we became. That was, you know, that's what we wanted to do.
And after listening to Tim talk today, you can all tell that he does an amazing job. And the team at AWC are just incredible. So together with the team, the board, the future of AWC is in great hands. So we believe no better investment to bequest to AWC. And we discussed this with our kids who are 22, 20 and 16. So they get it. And they're extremely supportive of the idea. Whilst wills are a tricky topic, in families, but taking the kids along the journey and showing them how passionate we are, showing them photos, even though they haven't gone to a sanctuary yet, which is a bit of a sore spot. But our kids are, these are really positive conversations we have, and the future of this beautiful country is, it's really important. But it's also important for our kids to learn that giving back in the world is so important. And, AWC is just one of the best causes. It's, and
So
we're passionate.
we'd raised the concept with them in discussion. We then worked with our financial advisor, who happens to be Andrew Sherlock from Sherlock Wealth. He and Jackie are very strong supporters, so maybe he wasn't going to be an impartial advisor on the concept, but he thought it was a great idea, but helped us to think through the structuring of that. And it's pretty simple in effect. In reality, how we've structured it, it's a fixed sum that we've bequested to AWC. That gets settled as soon as any of our major assets are settled within the estate, assuming there's no liabilities left for the children. So it's clean. Hopefully there'll still be a substantial sum for our estate's beneficiaries, principally kids thereafter. They'll be looked after. But they don't need the whole pie. Not in our view, anyway. And so we see it as a gift from them as well, because they recognise Australia's landscapes and all that was originally part of it, is a shared heritage and needs to be protected. And so that was really our philosophy, our approach, and we found structure in the end pretty simple, and a means of supporting the mission and the vision beyond our time. So that was really where we've got to, and as Georgie said, the great thing from the fringe benefit was enable a conversation with the kids and building awareness for them in bringing them on the journey. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Georgie and Guy as well, for just sharing a bit of your own personal story there with us, how you came to be with us on this journey. We've got a lot of chat and questions coming through, so I'm really keen not to hog the mic, because I would love our participants to join in with us. So I hope it's okay now if I start turning to the floor and I'm bringing some questions through. Carrie, please feel free to jump back in as well, so that we can talk about some of the questions coming through. Just in terms of housekeeping, if anyone's on the call who hasn't quite got to grips with the function yet, just have a look at the list of options down the bottom. You'll see an option that says more. Under that more, you can find a little link for question and answer. So just use that to pop your questions through if you would like anyone to answer them live. And of course, please just email me. You've got my email addresses from our monthly catch-ups, and Carrie also will be emailing you, so you can ping her as well. And Tim is always happy to talk. Guy, I know you are a volunteer, you generously, and also with you, Georgie, but Guy, as a board director, you volunteer your time, but you are also have indicated your willingness to talk one-to-one with those on the call, which is extremely valuable. So please don't feel that you've only got one chance to talk to us. We are here, we're not going anywhere. And in fact, that's sort of the whole point of this wonderful connection through our legacy program. I will now just acknowledge some of the questions that have come through before we opened up the webinar. And I'll start turning to some of those. So we have a question through, which is a really important question, and this goes to our priorities. We talked about how legacy gifts help us with future planning. If we knew that in any given year we've got a budget of somewhere around $30 to $40 million to spend on conservation, how on earth will we go about prioritising that work? So, Tim, if I might pose this question to you as the big boss, and this question comes through from one of our supporters on the call. How do you rate the projects in terms of urgency? What is the screening process that we go through to ascertain how we are going to spend these incredibly important contributions?
Excellent. Thank you, Amy, and thank you for the question. One of the best parts of being the chief executive of AWC is the intellectual conversation and questioning that you get, and the exposure to how people think about conservation in Australia. It's very, very rewarding. I suppose the beauty of AWC, if I bring it back to our value proposition, that we're a science-informed organisation. So it is using science, it's using evidence, data and knowledge to prioritise our programs. We have our eco-health framework, and that's really our prioritisation process. So we're in real terms, we essentially divide the country up into quarters. We have the northwest, the northeast, southwest, southeast, and that's how we structure the organisation with eco-health and land management programs across those. And when we get into the budgeting program period of the year, behind the budgeting program sits an eco-health framework. So we look at our ecological health outcomes, our eco-health scorecards, and we use that to dictate priority, where we need to bias our operating budget year to year. Beyond that, if we think about future acquisitions, we have a slightly different assessment of that, where we think about what are the emerging threats like climate change, and we've got a climate change strategy under develop. We've got an acquisition strategy under develop, which thinks about what are the species most at risk, what are the species most under pressure, what are the emerging threats we might need to deal with. But also starting to think about, going back to the climate change issue, we're likely to have to undertake things like assisted migrations for species, where you have a species within a traditional or historic range where potentially climate means it's no longer a viable location, and we need to take it out and set up populations in new regions of Australia. So we think about where can we be in the future, and this comes back to strategy, a strategic plan. Where do we need to be over the next 10 years to support those initiatives, both the here and now, but the emerging issues we need to grapple with over the next 10 years. Then there's a whole bunch of detail behind that I won't go into right now, but that's broadly it. It's science informing our programs. So it's a response of our management programs using our eco-health framework, our eco-health scorecards, and then thinking about our journey into the future through acquisition, climate change, and those lenses.
Thanks, Tim. And I think it's safe to say that forefront of our mind, as Tim mentioned earlier on at the head of the presentation, that really this is a time for us to be acutely focused in on those threatened species. What an incredibly critical time for these species in the face of unrelenting threats. And we are aware that 130 species were added to that threatened species list last year alone. I mean, the pressure is on, isn't it, Tim, for us to prioritise where we need to be, the work we need to undertake in support of those. And we've had lots of questions. We always get good questions around our research programme and our science programme. And I think that goes back to this point. So I might just take you to that question, Tim, in terms of our research programme. And broadly speaking, the question is, what is a summary of the research programme? How is that structured? What does it go to?
Sure. So I think at the moment we have 130 individual research projects. So that's a lot of research that's been undertaken, but the program management behind it, the first priority is really undertaking research to inform and help inform our management action. So where there's things we don't know, we undertake research to fill in the blanks. That's broadly the program behind it. Yeah. Then in addition to that, as I touched on around the acquisition strategy, climate change strategy, there's a lot of research in genetics. There's a lot of research happening in those spaces about understanding those inputs that we need to inform our future program. Then I'd call it a more operational level, there's a lot of work in technology that we're undertaking, and this is often done in collaboration with external agencies, particularly universities, and that's in the use of eDNA. And I'm always very interested in the use of technology and the innovation of technology. eDNA is important because as we scale up conservation outcomes across Australia, the biggest cost we have is salaries and wages. So how can we be as cost effective as we can be in sourcing and collecting data? So eDNA, give you one example, at our newest sanctuary, Wallenbach or Gorton Forest in New South Wales, we're using a little, essentially a fly strip that sits in the air in between trees, and it collects data or fragments of DNA that are floating through the air. The aim of that is to determine the presence of species. And so at Gorton Forest, we know there's koalas there, we know they're there. And so you use this as a proof of concept where there's bits of koala DNA floating through the air, and you can take that sample away and have a proof of it. Here in WA at Crackamar Wildlife Sanctuary, we're using spider webs because spider webs are out there in the bush between trees, and there's things floating through the air that will land on the spider web. So you take a sample of the spider web and you can determine presence of species. And we've done a correlation between the spider web and species that we know is on sanctuary. And it's all aligning. At the moment, it's really presence or not. What we want to move to is, can we use that to determine an indices around abundance of a species? So it's very interesting. Beyond that, there's technology in terms of monitoring programs, through camera traps, the use of satellite technology. We're working hard on a beyond the fence strategy. So you think about network of fenced areas. What is the work we can do safely beyond the fence? And here at Mount Gibson in Western Australia, we've been doing brush-tailed possums, western quolls or chuditch, and we're now thinking of woylies as brush-tailed beddongs, doing a release beyond the fence to determine determine really the algorithm for feral cat and fox densities where you can safely release vulnerable species into that environment. So it's a part of a bigger research project.
Thanks, Tim. We've just popped a link in the webinar chat to a web page which does show a breakdown of and a summary of AWC's conservation science programs. So if you're interested for more detail, feel free to jump on that page, and you can always connect through to us for more info. Tim, we often get a lot of questions in relation to our connection to government, and today is no different. We've got a question that came through prior to the webinar and one that's come through during the webinar around, firstly, the funding context, particularly in relation to the pervasive and continuing threat of feral cats, the appetite of all levels of government to support our feral cat eradication program. Can you speak to that, and just thinking also about the context of our partnership with government, where to from here with that government relations? What does it look like? Is it funding only, or can we go beyond funding?
Sure, there's a lot of different themes inside that question. So if I start off at a big picture perspective and then drill in specifically to feral cats. So in a couple of weeks, I think it's the 4th of May, the federal budget comes out. And so like many others, I'll be sitting there watching very carefully at what the allocation is to the environment at the federal budget level. I also do a similar level of monitoring at each individual state. What is their allocations towards environmental budgeting. Yeah, I've got reasonably good relationships with all the state ministers and departments and at a federal level as well. And the message coming back through loud and clear is budget constraints, budgets under pressure. Jim Chalmers was out recently talking about budget under pressure, that's the job of a treasurer, to be frank. It's the job of our CFO. Is budget under pressure? Finances need to be managed carefully. But if you take a decade-long look back at environmental allocations within budgets, they're in a continued decline. And you might get year-on-year tweaks and adjustments or some investment program, but as a general rule, as a percentage of overall budget, it's in consistent and constant decline. And that doesn't matter whether it's a Liberal or a Labor government, it's the same approach. And that really goes in stark contrast with where society is at. Society is demanding a greater response to the loss of our biodiversity. So there's an issue there that we have to be realists about the amount of funding we can expect from government. And whilst there's a lot of people out advocating for government to put more money into the environment, and they should. Government should be funding environmental conservation, but we need to be a realist that it's just simply not happening, and it hasn't happened for a long time. And that's why the beauty of AWC, the beauty of your support comes into being, that we're able to go off and deliver this in isolation or separate to government, but we work with government where we can. So we note that we've got contracts with the Department of Defence, the Yampi Sound Training Area, New South Wales National Parks, the Northern Hairy-Nosed Wombat in Queensland, and there's a level of funding around that. But in terms of pure discretionary funding from government, it's very little, and it's very little at an environmental sector, and it's very little to AWC. It's less than 1% of our recurring revenue comes from what we'd call government grants. It's a tiny fraction. In some credit at a federal level, they are and have been developing what's called the nature repair market legislation, which is legislation designed to find a way to support the investment of institutional finance or private capital into the environment through mechanisms like biodiversity credits. The problem is that's a big topic. They've released the legislation that's been finalised and passed through Parliament, but none of the regulation, the policy or the programs below that have been developed. And there is still a big difference between the need for a high level of integrity when you're developing biodiversity markets and what those who trade in these things need. So there's still a lot of work to go in this space. There's a lot of different themes to this, Amy. I'm just trying to narrow it down. So sort of bringing it back to feral cats. It's interesting that Tanya Plibersek came out, I think it was late last year, and declared war on feral cats, which is the same thing happened 7-8 years ago. I think it was, I can't remember the minister at the time, but one of the ministers came out and declared war on feral cats. I caught up with the Threatened Species Commissioner in Canberra a couple of weeks ago, and she's now starting to nudge government away from this thing of getting out and killing all cats, because it's just simply not going to happen. Until we can solve things around gene drive or other similar solutions, we can't go out there and kill cats at a landscape level. It's just not practical or cost effective. And that's why we need to invest in projects like AWC's network of fenced areas as being the only solution. In terms of at a more social level, and I think the question, picking up around all levels of government, there is actually some positive signs. You do have some local councils, particularly here in WA and other places, that are starting to bring in bylaws and controls against domestic cats. Whilst that's not going to actually have an impact at all on your feral cat population, what it does do is help inform and educate the community as to the impact of cats. So that is starting to gather pace, and there's 3 or 4 here in Perth local councils that are starting to introduce those bylaws. At a state level, I'm a member of what's called the WA Feral Cat Working Group. It's trying to bring everybody together in the state, or the stakeholders, to how do we solve the feral cat issue. And then there's a similar forum at a national level called the National Feral Cat Task Force, to try and find ways to bring everybody together to understand what are the most cost-effective and impactful ways to control cats. But ultimately, we're at a point in history where we can't control cats at a broad landscape level. You have to have these interim solutions like fenced areas, particularly in the south of the country, and in the north of the country, where you manage the landscape through fire, feral herbivores, and so on, to at least put some resilience back into the system. Amy, that's a lot of very abstract points around that theme of feral cats and government relationships, but hopefully it makes sense to everyone.
And I think it paints the picture of the complexity, but also of the very real requirement for us to look beyond funding and into action-based outcomes. And so that is where AWC has, its tried and tested formula, in that we are taking action right now, and we are doing it on our own sanctuary network, but also in those partnerships, because that's where we know we can add additional value. So thank you for that, Tim. We are out of time for today, but there are so many other questions that I would love to address. I'm just going to nod to the questions around sanctuary access and sanctuary visitation. We've had several questions come through prior and during the webinar in relation to coming out and seeing our work on country, on sanctuary. And I will acknowledge that accessibility to some of these places that we are protecting is extremely difficult and challenging. It is a rare and very unique opportunity to get out on sanctuary, but there are sanctuaries that are open. I might ask Carrie, if you don't mind popping a link in the webinar chat now. You can visit an AWC sanctuary. We have a web page that is devoted to information about how that can be done. If you are thinking of driving as self-driving and heading out for yourself, and you've just got a question that you'd like to ask a human about, please email events@australianwildlife.org.au. That will get you straight through to the team in charge. Look, not all of our sanctuaries are open for visitation all of the time, and some will ebb and flow. We had a really important question at the front of the Q&A, which was around prioritisation of resourcing and how do we determine where your contributions go. First and foremost, we always invest in our conservation effort. And so that will take precedence over visitation accommodation in the main. But we also recognise we need to bring the sanctuaries alive for you guys, because you have to be able to see the impact of your support. Where you cannot come out to sanctuary with us, we will always try and bring the sanctuary to you, whether that is one-to-one meetings, catch-ups, face-to-face presentations. Please look out for events happening near to you so that we can invite you along with us. There are some more technical questions that have come through in relation to support with gifts and wills. What I will say about that, Carrie and I will follow up with you individually. We're pragmatic, and we will like to provide information where we can. We don't give legal advice, and our first and foremost advice to anyone considering a gift in their will is to please speak to your family and loved ones as part of this process. Guy and Georgie, you consulted with your family and your decision making, and I think that that is very much in line with AWC's approach. That family first always, but we are trying to protect the natural environment so that our generations to come have a place for wild places and wild animals to call home. So, I think we're all part of this big family together. Look, I am so terribly sorry we haven't got round all of the questions today. I do see the others come through in the chat. We will respond to you directly so that we can honour your time and investment in contacting us. So on that note, Carrie, before I sign off, is there anything pressing that you would like to communicate to our supporters?
Just to say thank you very much for everyone for being here. I see so many familiar names among our participant list of people who I've emailed with or chatted with on the phone. So I appreciate you taking the time out of your day to join us, and to you, of course, Guy and Georgie, for being here as well to share your story. We so appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Carrie. And yes, from me to you, thank you, Guy and Georgie. Thanks, Tim. And thank you so much to all on this webinar. We really sincerely cannot do this incredibly important work without you. We encourage you to stay connected with us at all times. We are here to be accountable to you. So we will honour that with some responses to questions in detail. And meanwhile, a big thanks again for joining us on today's webinar, and we'll call it a day there, but look forward to connecting with you again soon. Thanks again.